President-elect Biden has unveiled senior members of his economic team today. Mr. Biden's picks will make history if confirmed by the Senate. His Treasury Secretary nominee, Janet Yellen, would be the first woman in the role. His budget director choice, Neera Tanden, would be the first woman of color to run that department. For more on the transition, I want to bring in Rebecca Kaplan. She's a CBS News political producer and joins us from Wilmington, Delaware. Hi, Rebecca. Great to see you. So what was the primary message Mr. Biden and his nominees wanted to present on how they plan to rebuild the economy in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, the president-elect's message right off the top was help is on the way. And the message from both him and his team was that the recovery we've seen so far is just not good enough. It may have benefited the wealthiest people in the economy who have seen their jobs come back, but has been problematic and devastating for many working-class Americans who have lost their jobs, who have not seen any relief from Congress, and that all of that needs to change from day one. And what was interesting was you heard those nominees talk about not necessarily their academic or work credentials, but their lived experiences with these systems that they would be in charge of. So a classic example, Neera Tanden, a nominee for Office of Management and Budget, talked about how her family relied on food stamps when her mother got divorced when she was a child growing up outside of Boston. That's experience with a system that she would help budget for right there. You had Janet Yellen talk about growing up in a working class neighborhood in Brooklyn and her father deciding to open his medical practice in a neighborhood where people who did not have access to cars, who relied on public transportation, could easily reach them. So the message today was the president-elect. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Please finish.
The president-elect is putting people in place. The president-elect is putting people in place who know what everyday Americans are going through with this pandemic, and is going to help them get through that by building back a stronger economy than the one he says we've seen so far. And this is a marked departure from a president who has largely measured the success of the economy by the success of the stock market.
Yes, I agree with what you said about how striking it was to hear of all these nominees discuss personal experiences and how they came to economics as career choices largely because of their personal experiences. You can see how that message is meant to resonate for Americans who are right now, struggling. What more can you tell us about Biden's economic nominees, particularly Yellen and Tanden, in terms of how senators are responding to them? Because, of course, they still need to be approved.
Of course. We haven't heard much on Yellen so far, which is probably a good sign. Fewer complaints means a better chance of success. And one key indicator is that in 2014, she was confirmed as chairwoman of the Federal Reserve on a bipartisan vote that included 11 Republicans. And 3 of those Republicans are actually still in Congress today. So that's a good sign for her when it comes to her potential of getting confirmed. Now, Neera Tanden, on the other hand, could be a little more troublesome for the Biden administration. And that's because we have seen several Republican senators in the last couple of days complaining that she has been too critical of them on Twitter. In particular, Senator John Cornyn of Texas called her radioactive, suggesting that could be a problem for her nomination. Now, Senator Schumer, the minority leader, got on the floor yesterday and reminded Republicans, if you're taking such issue with people who use Twitter to be negative, you might look no further than the head of your own party, who has called out his fellow Republicans on Twitter from time to time. But with so many things in the coming days, the nominations of these people will depend largely on who wins these 2 Senate races that are outstanding in Georgia. And that will determine control of the Senate come January. So we may still have a few weeks to wait before really knowing how successful the president-elect is going to be at getting his nominees through Congress.
Absolutely. And Rebecca, we're also learning some more about Biden's potential nominees for Defense Secretary. What can you tell us about that?
CBS News has learned that there are 3 potential contenders at the top tier of the list still being talked about, all of whom would add diversity to Biden's cabinet in keeping with his promise. You have Michelle Flournoy, an Obama-era defense official. She would be the first woman to lead the Defense Department. He's also looking at General Lloyd Austin. He was the first black commander of U.S. Central Command. Again, would be the first black man to lead the Pentagon. And then there's Jay Johnson, who was the first black man to lead the Department of Homeland Security under the Obama administration. And he actually has Pentagon experience. Prior to that, he was the chief lawyer for the Pentagon before going over to DHS during the Obama administration. So either way, you're going to end up with likely a woman or a black man in that position, which would be historic.
Another glass ceiling shattered there. Now, sources tell CBS News House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is resuming coronavirus stimulus talks with the current Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin today. We've also seen a bipartisan group of senators unveil a $908 billion proposal for relief. So let's hear from Senators Joe Manchin and Mitt Romney about this proposal.
Our action to provide emergency relief is needed now more than ever before. The people need to know that we are not going to leave until we get something accomplished.
I happen to be a deficit hawk. I don't like borrowing money. I don't like spending money we don't have. But the time to borrow money, maybe the only time to borrow money is when there's a crisis. And this is a crisis.
So, Rebecca, is there any momentum to get a deal done then before the end of the Trump administration, especially with those two Republican senators there leading the charge? What does President-elect Biden want to see in a deal that could potentially come before he takes office?
Well, the president-elect said today that first of all, he thinks Congress needs to act immediately and that anything Congress does now can only be the first step, and he wants to see additional relief coming when he takes office in January. And so he said that anything that happens now will just be the beginning of many, many steps to help bring about economic recovery. Now, looking at Congress, one thing we need to remember, there's obviously momentum among some of the lower ranks. That's why these talks are happening in the first place, and that's coming against the backdrop of seeing this dramatic rise in coronavirus cases across the U.S. However, what really matters here and what matters for anything in Congress these days is what the leadership thinks, and we are still waiting to hear them comment on this proposal. Now, we are going to hear from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell this afternoon. He is going to be key. Let's listen to what he said. He was only in favor of a much smaller package, around $500 billion, before the election, and even then there was not enough momentum to get that passed in the Senate. After the election, he said that he thought that some coronavirus relief was necessary and should get done before the year. The question is, how far is he going to come up? Because if you look at the Democrats, led by Speaker Nancy Pelosi, they wanted to see north of $2 trillion spent on some kind of aid, and including particularly aid to state and local governments that have seen their budgets decimated by dealing with the pandemic. Now, the Democrats have so far been unwilling to come down much. They've come down some in negotiations with the administration. Republicans in the Senate have been unwilling to come up. So we still need to see a path for these two key leaders to come together and agree on a number. And until we hear either of them say, and really both of them say that they're committed to this package, you may as well just not hold your breath on it for now.
Well, Rebecca Kaplan, thank you so much.
Thanks, Tanya.